everyone, welcome to the Mental Health Mukbang, where we try to make mental health easily digestible. My name is Jed. I'm a therapist based out of Los Angeles, California. And today I have a bowl of instant ramen and 2 eggs.
I'm Christopher Vo. I'm an LMFT based out of Houston, Texas. Today I've got a spicy chicken sandwich and some homemade chicken noodle soup.
Yum. I have something different today. I have a Korean red bean popsicle because it's a really hot day over here. So that's what I'm eating. Oh, I should introduce myself. I was so excited about the food. I'm Jeanie Chang, a licensed marriage and family therapist in Raleigh, North Carolina.
I'm Jenny Wang. I'm a clinical psychologist in Houston, Texas. Today I have the Power Grain Bowl from Zoe's Kitchen.
Nice. So today we'll be talking about boundaries in action, just different examples, right? Because in the past 2 videos we talked about how to identify healthy and negative boundaries, right? But it's a little bit more complicated than that. You have different power dynamics in different types of relationships. So Jeanie, I know your specialty is like corporate and the workplace, right? Can you talk a little bit about boundaries and how they apply there?
How much time do we have? No. The corporate workplace, I think boundaries are really tough, especially because just in general, you want to look good. And I'm not even talking about Asian American, across the board, people who want to move up the corporate ladder. It's very fast paced. So I'm saying this because I think people overstep boundaries a lot to get the job done and then go beyond that. And that's actually what a lot of what I talk about, being not boundaries per se, but just taking care of yourself and having that work-life balance and understanding what stress looks like and how you act out in that. So I think boundaries are very blurred in the workplace. I would call them not so much enmeshed because you're not enmeshing, but I just really think they have to be better defined. And there is a lot of the employer-employee boundaries. That is a whole different dynamic. Yeah. And I believe one of the people on the Facebook groups talked about workplace gaslighting. I'm bringing that up because I think that is very prevalent. People just think of gaslighting in abusive relationships, but by the way, you can have workplace abuse. So I don't know if I'm really answering the question to say it's very complex. And I think every organization has its own culture and is very different, but there are not clear boundaries as in, one department has boundaries and this is the way another department is. Not at all. I really believe the individual in the workplace has to define his or her own boundaries for their own mental health, their own emotional, social, and psychological well-being. So that's usually what I try to do. I mean, I'm talking about it as a whole, mental health in the workplace, but I'm really saying, hey, I'm talking to you individually. You have to define it for yourself to make sure you're taking care of yourself, because no one's going to say, hey, here are the boundaries. Don't do too much. By the way, you remember the double bind? The double bind. Do you guys know the double bind?
I know what a double bind is.
Mm-hmm. Okay. That happens a lot in corporate America, where you get 2 different messages at the same time. Don't work too much. By the way, I'm going to add these 10 projects on your caseload. And so the message is, okay, so which one do I do? That also inhibits good boundaries. So you end up going ahead and doing more of that work because your employer gave it to you or your boss gave it to you, even though the message is, we're trying to have a good work-life balance. I'm talking about that because that in itself, I feel like, can be gaslighting, where they're given those 2 messages and then the person's like, well, I don't know what to do, so I'll choose the lesser of 2 evils, which is to do all the work.
Yeah. So
boundaries need to be much better in place, and that's actually a lot of what I try to do and talk about that, but not in the word boundaries.
So you mentioned that term, workplace gaslighting, and I think, like you said, it is really prevalent, because when you're given those 2 mixed messages of, hey, we're trying to have a good workplace balance, but also here's all of this extra work, the subconscious thought that gets internalized is, I'm not fast enough or I'm not good enough, so I have to do more, try harder, right? And especially when you're on salary, workplaces do love to take advantage of these different things, right? A lot of work complexes are built with that in mind, obviously pre-COVID, where they have entertainment centers and gyms and restaurants and all that stuff. It sounds lovely, right, to have all those amenities, but they do it on purpose so that you never leave work, right? There's always a monetary value attached to all of these different things.
You brought up a good point. Sorry, I'm super passionate about this. That other double bind message of, you just talked about it, unlimited PTO. By the way, most corporate organizations have unlimited pay time off. People barely use them because that thought of, oh, we have all the PTO we can use, but by the way, we have so much work to do, we can't use the PTO. So that right in itself is a message given across where you feel bad taking your unlimited PTO. And there's so many people I see who don't take it. And then they're forced to take it maybe 2 years later when they have to take it because of certain reasons. But I'm bringing that up because that's another where I see boundaries coming into play.
Yeah.
So I think we should get into a little bit more detail about what those boundaries look like in action. Like when we try to enact boundaries in those types of situations, what are some examples of how that plays out?
But that's the difficulty of workplace boundaries, right? Because I feel like whenever people try to enact boundaries in the workplace, they feel like they're walking on eggshells, right? Because they don't want to get in trouble. There are very clear punishments if you exercise those boundaries in certain occasions. And I think a lot of times people will play on that threat, right? I had a job where I was a case manager before I went into grad school, and I was in charge of 30 clients. And she fired one other person when she saw that I did a lot of work, and then the third person went on maternity leave. So then I ended up being in charge of 88 clients. And at one point, my max, I was working like 130 hours in 2 weeks, something like that. 140 hours. It was ridiculous. Like I literally would sleep for 6 hours and then go back to work because they were failing their audit, right? And then how did they reward me? With paid time off that I couldn't take because I was the only person in the office, right? So what do you do when you feel like your boundaries are being disrespected in a workplace? I think the best thing you can do, honestly, my advice is to figure out as much as you can about a company culture before you step into the workplace, right? Ask people who work there, talk to management, try to figure out, go on Glassdoor, ask all these different questions, because like Jeannie said, the company culture dictates a lot of what actually happens with boundaries and action in workplaces.
I had to mute myself because I couldn't. Anyways, I don't want to hear myself eating. I was going to say, I agree with that. I really do. And I also would say, let's just say, one of the other important things to help you get through something like this at work is to find your colleagues. There's always strength in numbers. I'm not saying you're going to band together to fight the system, but to have that support, that really helped me. And it sounds like we have our own experiences, Chris, but mine definitely, where what I ended up doing was actually quitting. So I did, I tell clients, hey, if that is the best decision for you, where you may need to take a career switch, actually quit the job, because in the end, you want to be sustainable and just not have this job literally ruin your work life, your family life, etc. That was a decision I made. It's been a while now, or a couple years now, but still. And people are like, hey, Jeannie's a therapist. But I was actually in corporate workplace using my skills. But again, there were no boundaries. CEO calling me at 11 o'clock p.m.
Yeah.
Sorry, not 11 o'clock a.m. p.m. And, that's just not good. So,
Yeah. Yeah. And I think a lot of, with boundaries in all examples, I think it's very important to identify when your boundaries are being crossed early on and be consistent and firm, right? Because at the very least, workplace tends to have very clear duties, right? And I feel like work will always, if they can add more responsibilities to you, they will, because there's always work to be done, right? So just be firm very early on. And if they still encroach on you, I would have that conversation with management, with whatever, in a soft way. You don't have to be aggressive about it. And if they continue, like, as opposed to people who blow up and burn bridges and things like that, exactly what Jeannie said, look for another job, find a place with a better culture, use your networking. I know you're in private practice, Jenny, but have you ever had experiences or anything like that?
So for sure, I think during graduate training and postdoc and internship years, I think those though are very different because they're time limited, right? So in the sense of like you're hustling, you're working hard because you have an overarching end goal. You're trying to get licensed, you're trying to get your degree, da da da. And so there's that kind of environment. I think for me, that was in a way kind of acceptable. There were boundaries crossed, but I was willing to take it because the cost of fighting that was really high for me. Like I would have had to find a different postdoc. I would have had to find a different supervisor for licensure and things like that. And
Sure.
so I think it's not as black and white as they crossed a boundary and then I must always say something. But I think Chris is right in that we need to identify when they're being crossed. And eventually, if it gets to that point where it's like, this is really harmful, then yes, we need to have those conversations. Um, I remember, in private practice early on, I was an independent contractor with somebody, and there were just different things that made me uncomfortable. And I remember thinking, man, I don't think I could say anything. I was so much younger. It was their practice. And so even in those settings where, you feel like maybe there's ethics and morals and all these other things involved, not just time and energy, it's hard. It takes a lot of inner kind of courage to speak up and say, hey, I don't think this is right. I don't think
Absolutely.
this is the way we should handle clients and different things like that. Um, and I think for me in managing that has always been, what is my end goal? Right? If I was going to stay there for 50 years, I might consider, right, trying to change the system.
Sure.
But if this was a short-term thing that I could, get what I needed and move on, oh, maybe I wouldn't say anything because there was something else I was trying to get out of it.
Yeah.
And it's really hard in like work setting because this is like a livelihood, right? Like you need to pay the bills. You need
Yeah.
to. And so I think, yes, quitting eventually and finding a different job is certainly an option, but I feel like the cost is really high as compared to like relationships, right? Breaking up with a boyfriend, friend, conflict over that. There's just so much more nuance and so much more at stake, I think.
Yeah. And that's true, right? Sometimes the power dynamics don't allow you to speak up about boundaries. Like when Jeannie said, when the CEO calls you at 11, it's really hard to tell a CEO no, right? So it just gets complicated. Sometimes you do have to mitigate your expectations when it comes to boundaries. And
Yeah, I was just going to share. Jenny brought up a good point because I wanted to clarify that time frame of when I ended up quitting that job was actually a period over 16 months, not that long. But if you know day 3, your boundaries are being crossed and something is wrong, 16 months is a lifetime. So I share this because it took me that long, which even people are like, that's such a short time. But it took me a long time I had to figure out what I was going to do. And I think I planned my exit for like 15 months. So I'm just being honest where that is sometimes where it's like not black or white, but I was trying to exit because I knew every time from day 3 when something happened, I just went, no, I didn't realize this. And it was a mistake that I made, but that's okay. It's a good mistake. But yeah, it took me a long time. So sometimes to clients, it could take time, but at least if you have the hope of you knowing what's going on and you can have a plan on how to exit a position you're in or whatever that looks like. Right. So
Going back to what uh, Jenny was saying, I feel that there is like, I think there have been several situations for me at work where I was just like, yeah, I know that my boundaries in terms of what I'm willing to do and what I'm not willing to do are being crossed, and like I had some ethical concerns. And yeah, I think there are times where you realize, hey, it's not worth it for me and you to do what it was that I was doing. And sometimes you just have to realize that there's there are a lot of different factors that you need to consider before making a decision, like quitting your job or like deciding that the workplace is not like deciding whether or not it's worth it or it's even possible for you to change the system, right? And one of the biggest issues I have, especially when I'm working in community mental health, is there are systemic level issues like county level decisions that are made that I can't control, right? And no matter what I do, no matter what I say in my organization, it's not going to change because at the end of the day, the organization doesn't make the rules. That this is like a county-wide thing. And so there are certain battles that you just realize that you cannot, or is not worth your time to fight in your current situation. And you just have to say, hey, like, my boundary with what I have to do ends here, but my boundary for something else makes things a little bit more complicated. And I think work is one of those things where there's so much nuance depending on your company policies, your union if you have one, the dynamics between like the different people who are in charge. Like there's just so much going on that it takes a lot of effort and energy to try to navigate that. And I think when it comes to boundaries, it is really just acknowledging what you can and can't do and what you're willing to and willing not to do. And finding an okay balance between all of those things. Because very rarely are you ever going to find a work situation where you're just like, this is the perfect job. Because something like that, it doesn't really exist because there's so many things you have to give up on one end or the other. And I think it part of it is just kind of being realistic about what is acceptable and what is not acceptable. And I think that's kind of the nuance of boundaries, right? There's going to be different varying shades of acceptability for each person, and finding a place where you're not violating like your core boundaries, but you're also acknowledging like, hey, like this, there are certain things that are kind of immovable things in the system. And I think yes, we should fight those things on a systemic level, but there are limitations to the amount of energy that we have in any moment to make those efforts to change those things. And I think if you're somebody who has the capacity to dedicate their time to doing that, like more power to you, and I would love to support you. But for me personally, I have to choose my own battles because I know there are certain things that I can and can't do, and there are certain things that I have the energy to, and there are certain things that I don't have the energy for. And I think that kind of makes things tricky. And it really is a determination that a lot of people have to make for themselves, right?
Point about kind of the determination based on each person. I think this is where it comes back to, to me, I feel like boundaries are set based on, there's an echo. So boundaries are set based on how much we value ourselves. So if our self-worth and self-esteem and all of that is not great, we are much more likely to believe that we can't advocate for ourselves because we might lose our job if we say something, right? We don't feel like we have an inherent value to take ourselves somewhere else and somebody else being able to value us more. And so I feel like this is where therapy comes in, right? Like if you struggle with, feeling like you can advocate for yourself and really struggling with ideas of self-esteem and worth, this is going to translate into how you show up at work and establish those boundaries. If you feel like you don't deserve that, you feel like you should just be the workhorse of the company, that's what you will be because other people will make sure that happens.
I think that's such a good point because that has such cross applicability to relationships and friendships and all the other boundaries as well, right? That feeling of self-worth. So what do you do in the workplace? Because I know people run into this too of colleagues when colleagues try to be polite or you're not trying to, you know what I mean? When colleagues just kind of step on your toes and they don't mean to. What do you do with boundaries in those cases?
Are you sure they don't mean to? No, I'm kidding. That is a tough question because I feel like it's like a case by case basis depending on because how you're perceiving it doesn't mean that's necessarily happening and vice versa. I'm not saying I'm doubting the person, but I'm saying sometimes you're already triggered in a way by somebody either their personality is much louder than yours. A lot of it comes down to personality differences. Someone who thinks someone talks too much and in a meeting, but then they say this because they wish they talked more. So when I have clients who talk about stuff like that, or even in the workplace, they're talking in the chat box about, well, what do you do about this situation? Then I say, well, Jenny said it stems from you. You're the only person that can change, right? We would love to change somebody else, but it doesn't work that way. What's going on with you that you feel like this person is completely overtaking a meeting? Is that something you want to do? So I would say things like that, the challenge. And I feel like that's my job, to just also challenge to see that change happen. And I would say most of the time people admit, you know what, you're right. I really think it's because perhaps I feel like I should be doing that. So the boundaries there would be when someone feels like somebody overstepped their boundaries. I feel like it comes down to their own, I don't have a self-worth, but their own introspection of why they feel that way. Well, you know what? It's because they have the job I want. That could be an example. Or I wish that I could do it this way, or I'm not doing it this way, or this person doesn't make me feel valued. So I do agree with what Jenny was saying about it does come down to your own confidence level and working on that, so you can almost weed things out in the way that it's necessary for you. Because again, someone might ask me that question and there's no streamlined answer. I think because I feel like every situation is different, but that's usually the answer I give. I'm like, well, what's going on with you? Why does this person
Yeah.
make you feel this way?
Yeah. Because sometimes when you feel disrespected with your boundaries, it's not actually them too, right? We talked about that last week, where your own boundaries can be too firm because of something else that happened in your past or your life. So we have 2 heavy topics left. Which one do you guys want to tackle first? Family or relationships? Both of those are really fun in our communities, right?
Let's do family.
Okay.
By family, do you mean like parents, or do you mean nuclear, like family? What are we doing?
I think the parents pop up the most.
Yeah, that's what I'm feeling.
I feel like
So much to say on that, but I'll let someone else go.
I feel like we coexist in both of those a lot of times, right? Whether it's our own nuclear family or like came from, kind of, there are different dynamics that kind of come into play. I know that Jeanie has alluded to her difficulties in dealing with extended family in the past. Um, so I guess I'll just kind of start off with like a brief like thing into boundaries, at least based on what I've experienced and how I work with my clients, right? So I work with a lot of younger families. And that means kids under the age of 12 and parents. And so when it comes to those types of families, the boundaries are a little bit different because it's still a very distinct like parent-child relationship, and there are certain things that as a 12-year-old you just don't have the capacity to understand or do. And I think in those certain situations I tend to try to examine which boundaries are justifiable for that age range, right? And given the cultural context, right, what is okay and what is not okay will vary from family to family just based on upbringing. But a lot of times, what I've noticed is the people who have the most difficulty in that age range are people who aren't consistent with what those boundaries and are. And I think when it comes to family, it's really important to make sure that those boundaries are consistent, because a lot of times when you're interacting with somebody that often, you will find that sometimes you give something that you don't really want to, or somebody else gives something that they don't really want to, and then suddenly it becomes an expectation or a habit. And I think that when it comes to family, it's really about because anytime that you give and then suddenly like you're like you give it once and then you kind of take it away. I think everybody intrinsically kind of knows this, right? Once you give a kid a certain type of reward, like that, there's the expectation that I'm gonna get that again. And usually some of the biggest problems come from not getting the, like, I did the what you wanted me to do, but this time I didn't get the same reward. How come? Like, that doesn't make sense to me, right? And the biggest upset comes from the fact that I didn't get the same level of reward. And so I think it's really important that with any familial relationship that the boundaries are very consistent and very
I want to like speak on that because I think I'm now seeing that as a parent, and it is so hard, like, to be consistent and to be, because our environments and situations are always changing. And so as a parent, sometimes I'm like, no iPad before 4 o'clock. And then I'm like, oh crap, I have a meeting. Never mind, we're doing iPad at 10 a.m. Right? Like, it's just like, so I see the rationale for it. And I wish it was something that could be so, you know, well designed. But then real life happens. And then you're like, I have to make compromises. I have to pick and choose the worst evil, you know? Um, and so I think that could be the ideal, but I think real life is much more gray and, like, you know, nuanced. But yes, we try our best to not, you know, to not do iPad before 4 o'clock stuff,
And I
you
think
know.
that's part of it, right? It's like we need to understand that these things, like, as much as we try to be consistent, these things, like, things happen and we need to adapt to the different situations. So, like, when it comes to those, like, boundaries and, like, what the expectations are, right? Sometimes there needs to be an adjustment, right? But I think part of it is also just that clear communication of when a boundary is changed or crossed, like, what the circumstances are for that, right? Say if there's an expectation that, um, say, like, there's an expectation that so and so makes dinner on this day, right? But something happens and they're not able to do that, right? There needs to be an ability for people to understand, right? And I'm saying this is in an ideal sense, right? I understand that a lot of families are not as understanding. But if we're talking about, like, moving forward with healthier boundaries, things to keep in mind for the future, if that wasn't your experience, if you're moving forward, there is these are some tips to, like, how we can prevent that perpetuation of these um, cyclical boundary that often
Mhm.
lead to a lot of mental health problems for a lot. And so, if you are able to, right, I think the research has always shown that an explanation also assists with the understanding of, like, when lines are, I guess, boundaries. What am I trying to say? Basically, the when boundaries are violated and crossed, like, an understanding is very helpful to making sure that that doesn't turn into a bigger problem. And so basically what we're trying to say is, like, as we move forward, just to identify, like, how can we make sure that even when boundaries are crossed, we can still have um good, uh I guess, not so detrimental outcomes. And so, yeah.
Now, I was going to say I agree with both of you, but I was going to point out something with boundaries that I have found to be good is when it comes to discipline. So I know depending on the demographic, we're not talking about you being young enough to be disciplined, but when you're consistent in the boundaries of what consequences will look like, and when you cross a boundary, I guess that's the best word, when you don't listen to your parents or you disobey, whatever, I'm talking little kids, right? um, then I feel like it is very important to be as consistent with that, because you're actually helping your kids develop those healthy boundaries of just understanding their own security, the safety of what's good according to their parents. But I do agree what Jenny was saying. There's sometimes, depending on circumstances, but I don't know if that's necessarily boundaries or just the family rules that sometimes need to shift depending on family circumstances. Where the boundaries that I see that are healthy or unhealthy in a family have to do with those unspoken rules or the discipline that a parent wants to enforce. And I'm not an expert about it, I'm saying, but based on all the moms and dads that I work with, when I don't see healthy boundaries early on because of discipline, the unhealthy patterns continue into the teenagehood. And by then I usually tell them, and I freak them out when I say it's a little late. They're like, what? I go, no, it's not late as in to heal your family and work on conflict, but it's a little late to sit there and completely say, by the way, Junior, you can't do this after not doing that for 10 years. So I do say it has to start early on. If parents are watching that have super young kids, and your kids actually develop security, their own sense of security when their boundaries are clear and they're in place. Now, I don't mean rigid, but I do mean clear. And sometimes we do get, by the way, sometimes we're guilty of it. I'll be rigid, but I'll be like, okay, I'm too rigid. And I think it's important. So I hope if parents are listening that it's always about choosing to have healthy boundaries, but we're not perfect. So we will sometimes be rigid and enmeshed and whatever that looks like. But the goal is to make them healthy and clear. But yeah, that's my 2 cents on discipline. So that's me combining what Jenny and Jed both said.
I think
Yeah,
something. Oh,
that's
sorry.
why I don't work with blended families, because of the difficulties of that, having multiple households and just having boundaries all over the place. It's
Yeah.
just not fun.
I think as a parent, like for when I think about my own kids, though, something that I never got was this idea that I was allowed to set boundaries. Like generationally from my parents, it was like, no, you just listen to what we do, what we say. And I wasn't ever really able to say, like, no, I don't want to do this extracurricular or I don't care about this, and to say no. And so something that I'm being really intentional about with my own children is my daughter, like, we did piano and she just doesn't love it. And right in our generation, I was like, who cares? You just keep going. Right. Whereas we let her stop. It got to the point where she was so upset with having to practice and do it that it was like, she's clearly telling us she does not want to do this. And so part of if there are healthy limits, then there's room for negotiation. So she can say, I don't want to do this. And we can hear that and say, okay, maybe there's something else out there for you. And so I think breaking those intergenerational issues that Jed was talking about, I think it falls kind of on us to say, hey, maybe we can do it differently and encourage that feedback, negotiation, because that's a skill that they need as adults. Right? If she can't negotiate piano, how is she going to negotiate a promotion one day or, a raise?
I think one of
Yeah, some of
those.
the traumatic moments are me being forced to practice piano. So I get that. Good job, Jenny.
Yeah, I think that, like, if we're talking in terms of like attachment styles, right? Boundaries are what help people feel secure in their attachment to you because they know what to expect when something happens, right? And there's no like, oh, this time this happened, but what about next time? What about the time
Right.
after that, right? I think having that, that's kind of what I was alluding to earlier when I was talking about consistency. It's that it does kind of help with creating this stable world for, um, in this particular circumstance, children, right? But even as adults, right, in the relationships that we engage with our adult parents, we can also develop those types of secure, stable, kind of consistent boundaries that help people to realize, hey, like, you can't come here. Like, this is my space. And I think that the transition to adulthood is always very difficult, especially for us as Asians, right? Because no matter what we say, our parents are always going to be our parents. But what that looks like is going to change as we become adults and start to make our decisions. And I think I've worked with a lot of teenagers and young adults who have this transitional problem. And I think that's the direction I kind of want to take this, right? How can we move? How can we address these types of familial boundaries and as adults with our parents? And what does that look like? I think my thoughts are it looks different for everyone because everybody's situation is slightly different, right? But it is the same thing in kind of with your children, right? You're creating. It's kind of like conditioning in a in a certain sense, right? This like you learn how to respond when this person says something or other, and that's the thing. We're trying to for us or for our parents, we're trying to teach them like, hey, this is the type of response that you're going to get if you cross this boundary. And as adults, it is it can be hard for some of us to advocate for ourselves. Um, and I think that's what Jenny had touched on earlier. That's what kind of therapy is for, right? We want to empower people to be able to reclaim that voice so that they can start to advocate. And we do a lot of the troubleshooting in the background, kind of like this doesn't work, this doesn't work, but we find a way to try to help you to get to that place where you can finally say, hey, no, I'm saying that this is where the line is drawn. But yeah, what are some of your thoughts about how adult parent relationships kind of look, or adult family, adult parent?
Parent,
You know what? You
adult
get what I'm
children
trying to
and their
say.
parents.
Yeah.
Well, I
Just
think
ask Chris.
that has the most applicability within the group, right? Of what do you do, especially for our demographic, with parents that are very rigid with their boundaries, tend to overstep your boundaries, and also have control over your finances, your privacy, all these different aspects when you're living at home or they're paying for your college. What do you realistically do in those situations?
So we're talking about college students, right?
Yeah.
Because I think that's a
College
different demographic
students
than young professionals.
or
But if we're
like
talking
young
college students,
professionals who are stuck at home, maybe due to
yeah,
whatever financial situation, you know?
this is just what I say is that as difficult as it is, because I've also, as an adult child, deal with my own parents, is I do my best because you have to almost in that sense for them to hear you. Think about what would help them to hear from you to get what you want. So basically, you can't just say the first thing that comes out of your mouth because you know that's just going to lead to conflict and that's not good for anybody. It's just going to aggravate you more. So I say, hey, if your parents like talking about how much money that you're making or it's all about money, then how do you put that into conversation and start the conversation that way so their ears are at least listening and not defensive because you didn't start by saying, you guys just are control freaks about money. That's just you start off with that and hands down they won't listen or they'll get upset. But you start with an I statement, right? You know, the typical I statement. Okay, I am working my best. I am working so hard being at home, saving lots of money to be the number one, to earn six figures so that I can provide for my future family. But I would really like blah, blah, blah. So I always say start with, what's going well basically, or what your parent wants to hear. And again, it's not some adult children are like, well, that sounds so like I'm giving into them. I'm not, none of that came out of my mouth. It's just, I'm trying to get you what you want, but you also have to manipulate the conversation to go that way because the problem is they won't listen to you. You need them to hear you. So I'm saying this because I work on it very hard with my own parents. I'm like, oh, my mom wants to hear that their kids are eating well and I'm making them homemade Korean food when I'm not. But I'm like, oh, we just had a good meal. And then that's enough to be like, oh, good, for her to stop. Or, you know what I'm saying? So the perpetuation of that cycle always happens when you start off by saying what you want. I'm just trying to have you say, get what you want, but say the words that they might want to hear first. Manipulation of conversation. That's my 2 cents.
I think my thought on how to communicate with parents is provided, right? There's assumptions that your parents love you, that they really care for you, that they have your best interest in mind, just only in the way that they see best interest, right? Provided those are all true, I think sometimes I start off with this like idea of like, I know you're trying to show me that you care about me and you love me by doing X, Y, and Z. For example, like if in laws or parents say, I don't really agree with the way you're raising your children, right? That those topics, then I may communicate and say, I know you want the best for your grandkids. I know you're just trying to prevent kind of issues later on by bringing this up. However, when you do that, it makes me feel undermined. It makes me feel like I've been robbed of my role as a mother, right? And so I think when we're able to recognize the intention, then maybe they can see the impact, right? That the behavior, though it is intended well and to communicate love, actually is kind of hurtful and cuts me down in a sort of way. Now, not all parents can hear that, though, and I fully recognize that.
Yeah.
But I think that when we are able to communicate impact, and I think sometimes we shield our parents from the impact of their behavior because we're like, oh, they're never going to change. They're never going to hear me. So what's the point? And when I work with clients, I'm like, the point is if you never communicate, they will never know. So you just continue this cycle for the rest of your life.
Sure.
Now, if you do say something, you open maybe a door. If they love you, they may try with maybe 1% of effort the first time to hear you, right? But it gives you a path through. Otherwise, it's just a wall, right? It's just all these assumptions that you have about them and they have about you. That's my 2 cents.
Yeah, I like that intent, right? Because sometimes realistically too, they don't change, right? They may listen a little bit, but they don't change. And for me, listening to the intent versus the impact sometimes helps me have enough empathy that softens my own emotions about that situation, right? And I know I talked about it last time. If you are unable to change the situation, then something that helps me too is understanding that you become upset when the expectation doesn't meet the reality, right? So when it's something like verbal and I'm expecting that behavior already, it doesn't surprise me. It doesn't upset me as much because then I just go, oh, that's them being them again, right? And I can just kind of nod my head, smile, and walk away. And it doesn't sit with me for the rest of the day, right? Like it used to when I was young. And then if the boundaries are in fact toxic, right, and hurtful, I think a mistake that a lot of adolescents and young college students feel is that there is no other solution, right? They get so focused that there is only one future in front of them. Understand that there are a lot of different scenarios out there. You are just so stuck in your cycle right now that you can't see them, right? Just because someone is paying for your college doesn't mean that you can't get loans or work a second job or take some time off and, from school and really do that cost benefit analysis, right? Look at your end game, like Jeanie was saying earlier. And just, be creative and think outside of the box when it comes to different options.
I think that's a really good point, right? I think that part of what we do as therapists is we try to help people see what else is there, because oftentimes when we are
Yeah.
experiencing a lot of stress, right, um, whether it's our boundaries being violated over and over again or whatever it is, we start to feel helpless about our situation. And as a therapist, our goal is to try to help you just to see what you can't see right now. It might be in front of you, but I like to think of them kind of like as blinders, right? When you get so focused on something because it's taking up so much of your um, energy and like your basically it's taking over your focus mentally and emotionally, and it makes it hard to see the alternatives that are there. And so that's kind of what we want to do as a therapist, redirect some of that to give you a space where you feel like you don't have to deal with those stressors at the moment so that we can see the alternatives that may be
Yeah.
out. So
Yeah, definitely. I don't know about you guys, but we have gone a considerable amount of time. We'll probably have to dedicate another video to actual boundaries and talk about romantic relationships in general, right? Because I do think that's a multi-part series in and of itself.
We'll do, yeah. So I guess we'll take like relationships, like romantic relationships, and turn that into its own series, and there will be a episode on boundaries within romantic relationships because
And we'll be sure to hit that soon.
yeah, because I mean, even with like today's topics, I feel like we could create lengthy series, and we could go on for hours about
Yeah.
how we would navigate specific circumstances and stuff like that. But obviously, we don't have the time in one episode to do stuff like that. But so in kind of conclusion, right? Um, it really comes down to for individual situations. But when it comes to boundaries, I think we can all kind of agree that communication is essential to understanding and establishing boundaries and also
Absolutely.
and oftentimes the hardest part is maintaining of those.
Yeah.
Hopefully we've given you some insight. We've given you some things to think about. We've given you some hope for some of those or are kind of stuck, that it is possible to um, create and maintain healthy boundaries. So yeah, thank you for joining us, and I believe next week we're going to be talking about
Self-care. Let's
self-care.
do something happy.
Yeah, because self-care is something that we haven't, like, given the whole COVID situation, it kind of like boggles my mind. Why haven't we talked about this earlier? And
Yeah.
maybe this should
Really
just be like,
important.
yeah. So next week we'll talk about self-care and what that looks like. But yeah, thank you for joining us, and we'll see you next week.
Bye.